Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
Welcome. I am very excited to have Oswaldo Zavala back on for a second time to talk about his book, La Guerra en las Palabras. This book is an intellectual history of the Narco, quote unquote, from 1975 to 2020. Oswaldo is a professor of Latin American literature, and he teaches at New York University and the City University of New York, the College of Staten Island. And I absolutely love speaking to Oswaldo. I find myself challenged in the way that I think, and I find my framings around things to shift after listening and engaging with Oswaldo's work. So please enjoy. It is such an honor to have you back with us today.
Likewise, it's such an honor to be here, Todd. And I'm a big fan of the Border Chronicle and the work you and Melissa do. And so I'm very, very happy, and it's a pleasure to be here.
We do appreciate that a lot. We are so excited to hear that you have another book out, La Guerra en las Palabras, War Put into Words. Is that a good translation of that into English?
Well, it's an uncomfortable translation. I'm not sure exactly how to translate it. I think the one that maybe appeals better to the sense I'm using the sentence is war within words. So the idea is that war first appears in language as an idea, as a policy, and then slowly graduates into material effects of violence and governmentalities that end up affecting society at large, right? So, but the idea is to think of the dimension of language and the question of language as the origin for a lot of the violent imagination that it's encircling and framing the anti-drug policy in the U.S. and in Mexico.
Yeah, so that brings me to what you describe as in the book as the narco narrativa, right? The narco narrative, that sort of war within the words. I like that translation a lot better than what I said. And I wonder if you could kind of describe like what you're thinking with these narratives and this narrative.
Right. So, well, I think a first claim that I wanted to make in my book was that the war on drugs as a discourse is something very different from drug trafficking as a phenomenon. It's something that touches on the lives of many people in Latin America, producers and people who move drugs across the border, and of course ultimately consumers. So that phenomenon, the material aspect of that phenomenon is one thing, and the war on drugs as a discourse is something very different. And what I set out to do is to trace the history of the way we think about the drug trade, the way we talk about it, and the way certain official discourse from way back to the 1970s started implanting in us the idea that we needed to engage in such a thing as a war on drugs. So there's two moments that I think inspired a lot of the critique that I'm looking after. One is when in 1975, a special cabinet envoy from the Ford administration, if I'm not mistaken, came to Mexico City in a secret meeting with then Attorney General of Mexico, General Paullada. And they met to talk about the new binational military effort to eradicate marijuana and poppy in the Golden Triangle. And it is in this secret meeting that took place in November of 1975 that Mexico agreed to use paraquat, the very toxic chemical herbicide that is being used ever since, although it pauses at different moments in history to eradicate crops in the so-called Golden Triangle, right? That area between Chihuahua State, Durango, and Sinaloa, in the mountain area. And what I was really interesting to understanding is how these men together, in a close meeting, decided on the fate of a lot of people, thousands of people who lived in the mountains area where they have all kinds of exposure and vulnerability, and that ended up as a result leaving in massive exile onto the cities, cities like Culiacan, Chihuahua City, and others, because they basically made their place a living hell, right? And so I was really interested in understanding how this imagination of the war on drugs that ended up affecting a lot of people at first appear as a narrative, as something that these men were committed to doing in my country. And then if you move forward, there's a second moment that I thought was also extraordinary. It's a moment when President Ronald Reagan, in April of 1986, signs this secret directive to designate drug cartels as the new national security threat. And this is a second stage in this discourse that elevates this perceived menace, worldwide menace of drug cartels as, the new public enemy that had to be fought by the U.S., of course, in coordination with countries like Mexico and Colombia. Now, what is very interesting about this moment is that what we call cartels right now, had very little meaning in 1986, even to the traffickers themselves, right? Such as, for example, Rafael Caro Quintero, who was released in 2013 after a couple decades of being in prison, blamed on the killing of DEA agent Enrique Camarena in 1985 in Guadalajara. And then released in 2013 and then reapprehended not long ago, again during the new government of López Obrador. And what is really interesting is that him and other traffickers, including famous drug lord Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, both claim that the idea of cartel is something that they came to know in prison, right? When they were already convicted drug lords sentenced for decades for prison in life, right? Actually, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo still is in prison. I think he was finally moved to a lesser institution because he has all kinds of health problems. But both of them said in different interviews that the first time they heard the word cartel, was when they were in prison already, and they never really understood what was all that about, right? So what I was really interested in then testing out is how is it that this language created... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you're probably about to answer it, but can I ask, if that term wasn't used, what was it that
they used? Well, I mean,
or that they thought they were. Maybe it wasn't a particular term even. Go ahead.
Right. So this is really interesting, right? Because the DA calls them the Guadalajara cartel, and we know them now as the members of the Guadalajara cartel. But back then, one word that they kept using and circulating is the word federación, right? Some sort of federation, right? Of small group of traffickers that were not coordinated by a major boss of bosses, but most likely, and this is something they kept saying, by the head of the federal police, then Guillermo González Calderoni, who supposedly, according to Félix Gallardo, is the one who assigned the different areas for trafficking in the country, right? The famous map of drug trafficking, from Tijuana all the way to the Gulf cartel, right, in the Gulf of Mexico. So what is really interesting then is how language, right, constructed this reality for us very extemporaneously, very post factum, right? Something that never really happened at the time, and yet we perceive and re-narrativize the entire thing, in a sort of a regression, right? And retroactively thinking of cartels where they were none, right? This, of course, didn't happen just because the DEA started using the word, as I said, but because President Reagan in 1986 really brought these organizations to the center of the national security agenda, right? And so when I realized this, that that the national security agenda in the U.S. was creating this new reality, naming drug cartels and pushing for them to be at the center of a national security threat, replacing communism, right? Since communism is about to exit the world stage, right? It's a couple of years prior to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and a few years later, the Soviet Union altogether would be dismantled, right? So the narrative of communism being the threat is no longer really active, or is about to end. And so when I noticed this, then I really was curious to see how is it that this language that was creating this reality before it really becomes a thing was first enunciated. And so my book does that, right? My book it's an attempt to look at these words, the narrative of drug trafficking and how it changes from different era to era, and how it is very discontinuous, paradoxical, absurd, ridiculous, filled with fantasy and contradiction. And when you look at it, if it weren't because we're talking about very serious, violent things, it's almost a laughable matter, right? I'll give you one quick example. For example, in 1980, I believe it's 82. The DEA started investigating Felix Gallardo, allegedly the head of the Guadalajara cartel. Once again, the word didn't really was not really in use by the traffickers, but that's what they call them. And they called the operation Operación Padrino, right? Operation Godfather, right? And of course, they did so because the famous four Coppola movies were out, and the idea of a Godfather filled the imagination of the DA, because that's what really they knew about organized crime, right? So the organized crime experience the DA and the FBI had closer to their own agenda was the Italian American mafias in the Northeast, right? In I believe it's 92, when they start talking about boss of bosses and mafia lords, right? But back in the 80s, Godfather, right, was the key word that most people understood and knew because of the Mario Puzo novel and the Coppola movies. Now, Puzo himself has said many times that the idea of a Godfather was entirely his invention, that there was never a Godfather, that he knew no one to be called Godfather, and it's just something he liked, the word he liked, and that his entire fiction world, comes really from his mind, not from any empirical experience, right? He was not a reporter doing any kind of field work. And so what is really interesting is that the DEA takes this word out of a fiction novel, applies it arbitrarily to this Mexican trafficker, and he suddenly becomes, the Godfather, right? And now, up until today, people still call him the Mexican Godfather. Now, fast forward a few decades in time, and then a couple years ago, when you may remember when they arrested former Defense Secretary of the Peña Nieto government, General Salvador Cienfuegos, in the U.S., they also named the investigation Operation Padrino, Operation Godfather. So again, the word Godfather resurfaced, and the DA claims that a second-level trafficker identified General Cienfuegos as his godfather. Right? And of course, if you read the DEA investigation, and I did because the President Obrador made it public in Mexico after he was exonerated from all charges, you see that it's just filled with this wild fantasies, inaccuracies, this very, very dishonest investigation. Not that that the general is probably free of charge, because if we know, the general probably is guilty of different crimes. But in this particular case, the DA was just doing a very sloppy work based on this fictitious character, right? And so what is really interesting is then how language frames our imagination and just makes us all fall into this hegemonic consensus, right? The DA says so it must be true, right? That the defense minister is the godfather, and he meets secretly with low-level traffickers somewhere in a dark alley in the state of Nayarit, right? And that type of imagination I think it's very important to dismantle, to talk about, and to go to those roots, right? And that's what I try to do, right? So I try to do a genealogical history of this language, going back to the 1940s, when the national security agenda was first enunciated in the U.S. and how it affected Mexico. And I move forward in time all the way to the López Obrador regime.
Yeah, that's quite a time period for one. But also, like, thinking about all what you're saying, and also thinking about the border, right? And how really entrenched those sort of narco narratives are here. I have an example, and I hope maybe with this example I could tease out a question. I was in Nogales in Sonora in Mexico recently, and I hopped out of the car right along the border wall on the Mexican side just to take a picture. And I looked around. As I was doing it, there was a kid who popped up, and he just said, "Don't take any don't take any pictures there." And I went, "Okay." And I got back in. I didn't take a picture. I got back in the vehicle, and the person driving was like, "Oh, that's a cartel." And I thought, so a couple things like simultaneously. I thought, I'm like, okay, cartel, right? There's that word, right? And is is this kid like El Chapo, like 16 or something? Like, is it like the Sinaloa cartel, or like all these big narratives, like you're talking about, that come
Absolutely.
from all these places? On one hand, on the other, I'm very skeptical of that word, right? So
Sure.
I thought about your work for one, and I thought about how those narratives, like when you're in the border, that becomes a justification for building more of the walls, right? Like when you're thinking about it, the kid was there, right? The kid was telling me not to take a
Absolutely.
picture. So there's a reality there on one hand, but it's like there's a narrative on the other. So I'm wondering how you, like, is a cartel, that term invented by these narratives, and then what is it really? What are we talking about when we're talking about
Sure.
it?
Well, we tend to think of an hegemonic discourse sometimes as something that distorts our vision of reality, right? As something that either exaggerates or presents some sort of falsehood on what we're supposed to perceive. But in reality, when a discourse becomes hegemonic, what really happens is that it becomes your mediation with reality, right? It becomes almost your spontaneous contact with reality, not a distortion of it. You don't perceive it as something that it's meddling in your field of vision, but rather you really conflate a discourse with your own perception of reality. And so in Mexico, unfortunately, as in the US, when we use the word cartel and when we talk about organized crime and the transnational reach of these organizations, people do believe, because they've been told so by so many different sources and fronts at the same time repeatedly across decades, they do believe that these organizations are very powerful. They have thousands of people working with the reach and penetration to corrupt the high levels of Mexican government, to reach over 120 countries in the planet, and so on and so forth, right? And so when that happens, among people who are persuaded by this discourse are traffickers themselves, right? People involved in organized crime. They also themselves, and especially in a very special way, they engage with that discourse because there's a certain degree of desire to not only corroborate what is being told, but also to participate in it and to feel part of it. And this is a difficulty, for example, that a lot of journalists covering these topics, or people in academia doing cultural fieldwork, ethnography, cultural anthropology, etc., all these fields that need to be out there trying to test this reality face, right? Because they come with a preset of ideas and understandings that out there, there are people from the cartel, people informing, and children and women and older people are all involved somehow with the network. Now, the traffickers themselves believe that, and would love to be part of something greater than what they are, right? So I don't doubt for a minute that traffickers exist and they're out there, and some of them perhaps would rather that their picture not be taken. And I'm sure there are people of worry, people that we need to think about as a problem for governance and for just for the viability of our communities. But from there to leap, to the idea that these organizations are so powerful that they can overtake the FBI, or move money, hundreds of millions of dollars, and basically surpass the security holds of the global financial network. There's a big long range to make that distance, right? And so one kid becomes the metaphor of a word, right? One kid becomes a standing figure, right, for a discourse that cannot really be verified otherwise. And this is really the problem, right? It could be that kid, or it could be somebody else claiming to be the chief of the sicarios of the Guadalajara cartel, or the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. They can claim, that they met with the president and they gave him, $100 million in cash. But all that reality, is really based out on verifiable data, right? And so the problem is that most journalists, most people in academia trying to understand organized crime and its relationship with state power, etc., end up accepting without any evidence what it's been told by the official discourse itself. And what you're saying is very important, right? Ultimately, this discourse benefits the very same policies, right, that end up, affecting us all, especially, on those on the receiving end of the violent anti-drug surveillance techniques, right? People, usually poor people in Mexico, racialized communities, that end up, having over policing of their neighborhoods, and who end up, killed by these policies. I'm thinking, for example, the horrible case of those kids in Villas de Salvarcar back in 2010. Kids from middle school and high school celebrating the birthday of one of them in a working class neighborhood in the southern part of Ciudad Juarez, who suddenly were raided by what was perceived to be some sort of operation, and they ended up being killed mercilessly by this armed commando without any identification tags or anything. And of course, the crime was blamed on drug cartels. And a lot of people believe to this day that that's what happened, right? That drug cartels were fighting each other, and that mistakenly they went into the wrong house. But reporting like yours, when you're thinking of how much money we're spending on policing and the border, and how much money we're spending on national security, well, tells you that in reality, it's not a mistake in the greater sense of the national security agenda, right? These policies end up killing people, right? And these ideas, this perceived notion that the border is really taken by drug cartels, and ends up, with somebody pulling the trigger, right? Unfortunately. So going back to the question, people believe in this language, in this narrative, because they have already accepted it as the base line of their perception of reality.
Yeah, and I mean, you probably see it all the time, like how hard it is sometimes to talk about it. There's so many seemingly preconceived ideas. So I'm wondering about that, but I'm also wondering about, like, as I think of how these narratives play out, and thinking about, like, the state, for example. Well, then, if you pose that the organized crime, or the quote-unquote cartel, is quote-unquote bad, then the state is good, right? And then so the state becomes the solution, right? And then also, do you feel like those strong narratives, those entrenched narratives, then obscure, like, other things that are actually really happening? Like, for example,
Absolutely.
yeah, like, you make this great point about, the mechanisms of capitalism and how they're working in Mexico, for example, or even, looking at different things that seem not even to be on the radar of media at all, like the free trade agreements, and or exploitation of resources, and so I'm wondering if you can talk about how those narratives play, like, yeah, all of that.
Well, it's really interesting because, in order for us to really pose some sort of challenge to this narrative, we need to think outside of it, right? And we need to see first how it's framed, how it's enunciated in the first place, and how it's, just written with all kinds of fantasies and absurdities, right? The idea of a cartel, as I mentioned, it was pure fiction. The idea that the cartels move billions of dollars is also disproven over and over again. And yet, a lot of this information still circulates because it gets repeated by journalism, by academia. Even though there's a lot of data out there that disproves the idea that the cartel is really an empire, a global empire of immense wealth and military reach, almost, right? That on one side, but then going after that narrative, when you need to look at the different aspects that surround anti-drug policy in Mexico, for example, and in particular in the first decade of the 21st century, we had two things happen simultaneously, right? On the one hand, we had the Bush government and then the Obama government very aggressively supporting and embracing President Calderon's militarization for the new war on drugs and the deployment of thousands of soldiers and federal agents all across the country. And there was a continuity between the Bush administration to the Obama administration that very clearly made a hero out of Calderon, and the gruesome killings did not really matter because in their view he was bringing the war to the cartels, right? Now at the same time, the State Department in the Obama administration in particular was very aggressively pushing for energy reform in Mexico. And what is very interesting is that by the time we reach to final consensus in 2013, and the vote comes down in Mexican Congress to open up to foreign investment different aspects of energy, oil, gas, etc. Mexico is already in flames, right? You have a country that went from a murder rate of 8 or 9 killings per 100,000 inhabitants to some places to over 220 killings per 100,000 inhabitants, right? So we went from, for example, in Ciudad Juarez, my town, from 340 killings in 2007 to over 3,000 killings by 2010, right? So what is very contradictory is in this violent arena is that in those places where the militarization was deployed, in many of them, extractive projects were happening at the same time, right? And this is something that we most of the time do not think of with the same lens, right? So you take, for example, the state of Tamaulipas, that where the famous the Zetas cartel, this ex-military group, was terrorizing and depopulating entire communities at the exact same area where a massive infrastructure project was undergoing to extract natural gas, shale gas, right, out of Tamaulipas and crossing all Mexico all the way to California. And this is one of the major infrastructure developments that continue over in the Peña Nieto government. So it makes you wonder, how is it possible, right, that in the most violent cartel in Mexican history, according to some reports, basically reigning over the state of Tamaulipas, allows somehow for the extractive industry to keep on going, right? And the same situation you see in Guerrero, you have the Ayotzinapa disappearance of students, and we all thinking of, corruption and maybe some local drug gangs doing this, but you have one of the most important mining projects from Canadian companies and others undergoing in that state. And you can keep on moving, throughout the country in that direction, and finding that places of extraction are also the places of immense violence and militarization, and this idea of drug trafficking taking hold. Nowadays, for example, in the state of Sonora, where there's a large unproven but supposedly there reserve of lithium, suddenly cartels are also declaring that as a war zone, right? And they're fighting for turf in small towns that most people haven't even heard of, like the town of Caborca in Sonora. So it makes you wonder, why is it that the militarization coincides usually with these places of extraction, and somehow these transnational companies extracting gas, minerals, lithium, or oil make it through this cartel violence, right? So there's something there to be considered. Some academics and journalists have initiated this discussion. People I respect, like my friend Guadalupe Correa, who's written a very important book about the Tamaulipas case called Los Zetas Inc., published by the University of Texas Press, also translated in Spanish, and other journalists like my friend Federico Mastrogiovanni, who has done this reporting and trying to understand this. At the same time, of course, at the Mexican federal government, you have that those very people who put in place a lot of the aggressive energy policies during the drug war ended up in the revolving door of life after being in the cabinet and becoming members of boards, of energy companies in the U.S. or elsewhere, right? There's many cases. My friend Arturo Rodriguez, another journalist out of Proceso magazine, has tracked, I think, over 120 cases of, cabinet level appointees from different administrations that end up, with, cushy jobs in important transnational energy companies. So you cannot really understand how is it that if Mexico is supposed to be a failed country, overtaken by drug lords and drug cartels, is at the same time, a country open for business, for extraction, where things go smoothly, and where, you can lay out a pipeline, 1,000 kilometers across the country without cartels messing with the project, right?
Good point. Yeah, I think that's some really worthy terrain to look into journal. I mean, I speak from as a perspective of a journalist, like to look at journalistically. Yeah, and so I have one last question, I guess, as we wind down here. And this has to do, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico. It's true that he declared an end to the drug war. It was 2019, and so you have sort of that declaration, but yet, the kind of facets of the same dynamics of violence, you see still present. So I'm like wondering what you think about Lopez Obrador's declaration. Two, you make these really like great points in the book, especially around the narrative creating an alternative reality, right? That point. And also, like, what, like, for something that's so entrenched in the way of thinking, entrenched in the narratives, entrenched in the fiction, entrenched in the TV dramas, you make this great point about, like, to stop this war and to view it as a war is to, like, this sort of language, these words that are using, are giving it rationale, are what needs to be changed, at least as a first step. And I don't know if you could speak more to that.
Sure. Well, this is a complicated issue, right? So President Lopez Obrador came to office with the promise of ending anti-drug militarization, of pacifying the country, and to stop state violence. Basically, he had a very, very strong critique of the armed forces and the way they were engaging in crimes against humanity and over militarizing areas where the poor would suffer most in different parts of the country. And of course, I agree with that agenda, and I thought it was right on target. So when he came to office, he declared that he would end the Kingpin strategy, the infamous Kingpin strategy, the DEA logic of attacking heads of organizations, arguing that in doing so, the organization itself would crumble, right? And of course, we know now, after decades of experience with these criminal policies, that of course that doesn't do much in reality. It just keeps on forever enlarging or fragmenting different groups and making these groups just simply even more difficult to locate. Now, that also it's contraproducing because we know for a fact that most of these alleged heads of cartels really are not so, right? And this is what El Chapo Guzman said in trial, right? He said, look, I was ahead of some traffickers, but once I came down, nothing really happened. The organization doesn't crumble because there's no such organization, right? You just have a dispersion of many traffickers moving drugs across the border that do not depend on him or on his people to do anything in particular, right? Actually, his defense argued that he was not the boss of anything, and on top of that, not much money was found in his supposed large fortune, right? Neither the Interpol or FBI or DEA found secret accounts of money hidden in Switzerland or anything like that, right? Now. So when Lopez Obrador comes to power, rightly so, he questions all these fantasies of the anti-drug policy. But the day he did so, and this is something very much contradictory, and I note this in my book, the head of the Marines, General Ojeda, Rafael Ojeda, comes out in a press conference announcing that they're gonna have to begin a new strategy on against the cartel of the huachicolero, which is the word we use in Mexico to name fuel theft, right? These organizations that poke holes in pipelines to extract illegally gasoline or oil, all across the country. According to some reports, there are about 10,000 of these sites, illegal sites, or pipeline perforations. So what is extraordinary is that here we have the Mexican president saying we're not going to attack drug lords anymore, but then the head of the Marines, the Mexican Marines, is saying we're starting a new war against the huachicoleros because they have also created their cartel. Is the new cartel of Santa Rosa de Lima. They already had a name. There was a huachicolero lord. There were now folk songs, corridos written about them. There was a popular telenovela that ran in a major TV network. And so basically all the culture around drug trafficking was suddenly transferred to this fight against huachicoleros. And it didn't stop there. It doesn't stop there, right? Then a couple years later, under pressure by President Trump, President Lopez Obrador engages in this radical anti-immigrant policy, right? And now, the idea of the bad hombre crossing the border translates also into domestic policy. And so he starts militarizing the southern border, the northern border. The military takes over custom checkpoints. Even now they control the new international airport. So there is an entire mentality, an entire rationale of our country under national security threats constantly. And it doesn't have to be in the name of drug trafficking anymore, right? It can just be any common enemy that the government points at, right? And it could be undocumented migration. It could be, fuel theft. It can be just simply people moving across the country existing that can be perceived as a national security threat. And so my point to this is that in order to really interrupt or short circuit this violent policy, we need to look at national security altogether as a paradigm, right? Not just drug trafficking, because drug trafficking just happens to be one of the latest iterations, from the 1980s playbook in the post-Cold War era, right? But in reality, the national security age agenda it's something that keeps colonizing our public discourse, and it asserts itself in all different areas of society, right? National security can be just bringing the COVID vaccine to rural areas in Mexico, right? So supposedly cartels were doing that. Cartels were taking the place of the state because they were now feeding poor communities during the pandemic. And so this idea that somehow the country is always under attack, that we need the military for special purposes, just keeps coming back to us in full force, right? And it's never going to stop unless we criticize in general, this national security policy, this national security paradigm, right, that begins even way back before drug trafficking is even talked about the way it is now, right? It begins in the 1940s, when the U.S. is reorganizing the world after the Second World War and creating, institutions like the National Security Agency, the CIA, reorganizing the Defense Department, and so we've been since day one in Mexico subalternized by this national security policy, this national security agenda and paradigm, and we never really tested it and challenged it, right? And I think we were never going to really get past this entrapment of following the U.S. into its domestic and international fear mongering and war calling, unless we really think of this. And one last thing I would like to say is that we keep talking, right, about the war on drugs as if really cartels had the way to fight back, as if really the armed forces were fighting a real enemy. But what you see after the tallies come down, the official tallies of victims and people killed during this so-called war, is that the general average of people killed by the militarization is usually young brown men from 17 to 25 years of age, and who were born poor and died poor, right, with very little or none education, right? And this idea that, the country is under attack must be challenged, right? And we're not under a war, right? We're under a very brutal policy of extermination against poor people. This is really the right name of the war on drugs, right? It's a policy of extermination of poor brown people that keeps doing this horrible nightmare to the most disenfranchised in the country. And so in order to escape this, I think we need to, as a country, as a society as a whole, but not only in Mexico, also in the US, to challenge together this national security paradigm as a storytelling machine, right? As you and I mentioned in our first podcast, right? We what we are facing is a powerful machine that disseminates narratives and keeps creating monsters at our doorstep every single day, right? So we need to go at that root and cut it, right?
Thank you so much, Oswaldo Zavala. It was great to have this conversation with you today. And if people want to reach you or see your work, or where can they go to find you?
Well, my previous book, Drug Cartels Do Not Exist, has been published in English, as you know. It came out last year at Vanderbilt University Press. You can buy it in Amazon. La Guerra en las Palabras, it's being translated, but it's not there yet. So far, you can find it in Spanish. You can also buy it in the U.S., not only in Mexico. It's accessible in the U.S. also as an ebook, and an audiobook is coming also pretty soon. And I'm on Twitter, Oswaldo 2_ Zavala, and usually happy to answer all questions from readers and to keep engaging in this very important topics.
The Border Chronicle is reported by Todd Miller and Melissa Del Bosque, based in Tucson, Arizona. This interview was edited by me, Lily Clark. If you like what you're hearing, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform. It'll help other people find the show. You can read and listen to more local border reporting on our website, theborderchronicle.com.